Welcome to this episode of Orthodontics in Summary. Today's lecture is entitled Indications and Application of Minimum Anchorage Mechanics. This was a lecture by Vishnu Raj. It was divided up into two sections. The first, looking at the indications for minimum anchorage mechanics, and the second is how to mechanically deliver it, with a focus on Burstone's mechanics. So, the classification of minimum anchorage. It's where we're allowing 75% of posterior movement to take place into the extraction site and minimum incisal movement to occur. When is this scenario going to take place? Well, it's usually when we have mild anterior crowding or posterior crowding that we're managing. Now, Vishnu explored the etiology of this posterior crowding, relating to greater tooth sizes of current day man compared to prehistoric men, and the idea we're getting greater impactions of our 8s and 7s as a consequence. Now, premolar extractions can aid this process. We get mesial movement of the first and second molars occurring, and we can get between 3.5 and 4.6 millimeters of mesial movement of those molars. The second half of the lecture focused very much so on the biology and how to mechanically deliver this minimum anchorage situation. So the biology, well, it's easier to have the scenario of minimum anchorage, allowing more mesial movement to take place in the maxilla than it is in the mandible. And the reasons for that: growth favour mesial movement of the upper maxillary teeth, but also the bone is less dense. We know from Devlin's paper from 1998, the posterior maxilla in its cortex is 0.3 grams per centimetre squared thickness, whereas the mandible is 1.1 grams per centimetre squared. He described how do we prepare the anterior anchorage, and he gave a list of options for us. He spoke about working into our full-sized arch wires and waiting 4 to 6 weeks for them to become passive, reducing the friction and strain. Starting space closure 1 to 2 weeks after the extractions, so we're controlling the extraction site precisely. Exaggerating the curve of SPI, or curves in the arch wire. Now, Vishnu's lecture focused on the second order, or Burstone's geometries. Now, I will be honest, Vishnu posts regularly on social media, and whenever I see the word Burstone's geometries, I panic scroll past them. This time I haven't, and I'm glad I haven't. It's not as complex as I thought it was. So what's the theory behind this? Well, the idea is that a bend is placed in the second order, a gable bend or a V bend of around 15 to 25 degrees. And the idea is, depending on where it's positioned in between two teeth, it will affect the moments taking place on the adjacent teeth. So, as this then unfolds, what do we see happening? Well, the example is given in the extraction of the lower second premolars. We've got posterior crowding, and that's our scenario. The second order bend is placed in a 1925 stainless steel wire, a third from the distance of the lower fours. This is a Burstone 4 geometry. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at it from the anterior teeth and the posterior. For the anterior teeth, that are only a third from this bend, we have a mesial and extrusive vector. We're stopping the teeth from distalizing into that space. Let's have a look at the posterior teeth. So they are further from this bend now, and as a consequence we have a intrusive force taking place and a small distal vector. And the great thing about the Burstone geometries is that as space closure takes place, it also changes the forces. So space closure is occurring through our power chain or Knight-Eye closing coil, and now the 6 is moving closer towards that bend. This changes the scenario from a Burstone 4 geometry to a Burstone 6. This is where we have equal and opposite forces. So looking at the scenario again, now on the anterior side where our first premolars are, we still have our mesial vector, but it's been reduced. Now that the 6 has come closer to the bend, it now has a distal vector which is larger, but equal to that of the first premolar, and an extrusive vector as well. What are the advantages of doing this? Well, we've been able to preserve our anterior anchorage, and more so in the mandible than the maxilla. We've also managed to obscure or eliminate the side effects of closing space, the dumping in of teeth, the natural tendency for the 6s to mesially tip into the site and for the 4s to distally tip as well, by having these vectors in the opposite direction due to the bend. Vishnu finally concluded with a third order bend, which is possible as well, using an increased stiffness of a stainless steel wire, putting in an anterior torque, or going to 1925 stainless steel will also reinforce our anterior anchorage. And the conclusion from Vishnu's lecture was that posterior crowding should be considered in our case management. We should consider using second and third order bends to manage our anterior anchorage when it's required, and really controlling the incisor tip and position, and that influences the lip position as well. Hope you guys have enjoyed this episode with video. Please do subscribe and look forward to the next episode.